Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second edition of Harwood Half Hour. I'm Rich Harwood, President and founder of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. It's good to be with everyone today. And today's topic is, as you know, in the wake of violence that we've witnessed and incivility that we're experiencing in the country. Why is it so important to turn outward today, both for you as an individual and for all of us in our work? You know, before I get started, why don't you just flip me a message, if you would, just letting me know that you can hear me, and also let me know where you're coming from today. Where are you? That'd be great. So I don't know about you, but you know, for me, this past week, 10 days has been really trying, really difficult personally, just on a personal basis and also in terms of work. You know, we saw last week 12 or more pipe bombs being delivered to political leaders and other public figures across the country, and it just makes us wonder what's going on and where does it end. And then this Saturday, all of a sudden, I just flipped on the TV Saturday morning to check in on the news, and I was shocked in horror to see the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life, where 11 congregants were slaughtered by gunmen who came in during Shabbat services. And then this weekend as well, I believe on Saturday, 2 African-American women were gunned down in front of a grocery store. This after the gunmen had tried to gain access to an African-American church. And so, you know, this violence that we're seeing, the incivility that we're seeing, the kind of hate mongering and demagoguery and fighting and pointing of fingers and casting of blame that we're seeing all over the country. You know, again, I don't know about for you, but for me, this has just been it's been a tough week. And so I just want to talk about how we respond to this and why I think turning outward right now, especially now, is so important for you as an individual and is so important for all of us in the work that we're doing. You know, it would be easy to retreat right now and to hunker down, to turn our backs, you know, sort of like when you wake up in the morning and you pull the blankets over your head. It'd be real easy for us to do that. And I think we need to avoid that. I think we need to try to resist that. I think we need to fight against it. I think we need to bring ourselves forward into community life and public life and turn toward one another, not away from one another. So that's what I want to talk about. And in thinking about this, you know, I often think about this as a fundamental choice that we face. And this may sound abstract. It may sound like, you know, some political mumbo jumbo, but I really do believe this, that I think each of us faces a fundamental choice. And I think we face in this country a fundamental choice. We can descend further into the destructive divisiveness that is gripping our country right now and sort of cede the public square, community life to hate mongers and demagogues and folks who are in civil, lack civility. Or we can choose to figure out what are those things that we do share in common, and how do we actively build upon them to build a more hopeful society, to act on the sense that we can do better, that we can actually be better as a country and as individuals, as you and I as individuals. And so the first thing I want to focus on is why do each of us, why do you and I, why do we need to turn outward personally? And here's one of the ways in which I think about it. You know, when you're watching the news, or you're introduced to someone, or you're at a meeting, or you're, I don't know, at a conference, and all of a sudden someone starts to talk, or they're introduced, and all of a sudden they may be introduced, or you see them and you see them as someone from the white working class, or you see them as someone who subscribes to Black Lives Matter, or you see them as someone who's from a rural area, or you see them as someone who's an evangelical, whatever it may be, and all of a sudden in your mind, as you're seeing this person or watching the news or listening to this person, again, whether it's in your office or in your working communities or in your personal life, and all of a sudden in your mind, this label goes off, and you label these individuals in the ways in which I just talked about. And in labeling people, we immediately shut ourselves off from what they may say. We immediately ascribe certain motivations to them. We kind of immediately assume we know what they're going to say, and if they actually say it, we assume what they mean by it and what their intentions are and what their motivations are. And before you know it, we've sort of, through these labels, these quick labeling of people, we put people in a box, and we either see them as part of our team, you know, wearing the same jersey as we're wearing, almost like our sports teams that we root for, or we see them as the opposing teams, or increasingly, we see them as the enemy, right? And so many of us, it seems to me, myself included, we all do this, it's part of human nature, but I think it's gotten worse as the violence has gone around the country, as, you know, as we label people Trump voters or Hillary voters or Obama voters or whatever it may be, and we make these assumptions, and all of a sudden it leads to more incivility, it leads to us shutting ourselves off from one another, it leads to all sorts of assumptions. From a personal point of view, you may feel hopeless and helpless, like there's nothing we can do about this incivility, there's nothing we can do about this hate and violence, that we're just powerless. Someone at a vigil on Tuesday night turned to me and said, Rich, you know, I just feel so helpless. I feel so helpless. And I said, you know, I can understand why you feel helpless, but we don't need to feel helpless. We don't need to feel helpless. We actually can make the choice to figure out what we share in common and actively build on it. I actually believe that, and I don't just believe it as a theory. I've seen it happen in communities all across our country and in other places as well. So from a personal point of view, here's what I want you to think about. When you meet someone, or you're talking to someone, let's say at dinner or at a family function, or let's say Thanksgiving that's coming up in a few weeks, where you're probably worried, what happens if we start talking about politics or something in the news? Here's what I want you to try, 3 easy steps. Number one, each of us, when we see or hear these arguments or see these people and label them, we reflexively put these labels on them and assume we know what they're going to say, and assume, if they're from the quote-unquote other side, that they're wrong, that they're the enemy, the opposition. So here's what I want you to do. Number one, suspend that reflex. Know that you're going to have it and catch yourself. Fight against it. Don't ascribe certain things to people simply because they voted for one candidate or another, or the color of their skin is one thing or another, or because they're from one area of the country or another, or whatever it may, or because they hold some political view or another. Suspend it. Fight against it. Number two, be curious. Be curious. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to be curious and try to figure out, so who is this person? Not what's their label and why do they have that label, but who is this whole person? We're all, each of us, more than our labels. We live entire lives, whole lives. We're made up of lots of sides of ourselves. So be curious about the person. Take a posture of curiosity and figure out what they're about. And then third, seek to understand rather than to convince the other person that they're right, or that they're wrong, sorry, or that you're right, or that I'm right. And just try to understand where they're coming from and why they're coming from those points of view. And just see whether or not you can do this. See whether or not you can do this when you're watching the news, when you're introduced to someone, when you hear someone at a conference, or even at Thanksgiving dinner in a few weeks, which might be a bit tough to get through. So think about that. I think turning outward toward one another, if we can do this on a personal basis, will give us a greater sense of control over our lives, a greater sense that we actually can contribute to change in our own personal lives, a sense that while we may disagree with people we know, even love, or maybe just met, while we disagree, that there are some things we do share in common, and that instead of focusing on all those things we disagree about, maybe we should try to figure out what we can build on, what we do share in common. And again, you know, as corny as it may sound, that we begin to see the humanity in one another again, and not just see each other as the opposition or the enemy. So that's the first part. What can we do individually to turn outward? The second part is, why turn outward in our work? And here, again, I think given the condition of the country, the communities that I've been traveling to, the people I've been speaking with every single day, day in and day out, I think we can't figure out how to move forward as a society now. Now I'm not talking about in your personal life or in your family life or with your friends, but here I'm talking about as a society. It's just impossible to figure out how we're going to move forward as a society if we're not turned outward toward one another. I think of it this way. How could we possibly know what matters to one another, what we share in common as a society in our communities, if we're not turned outward toward one another and listening toward one another and figuring out what it is that we share in common? It's not possible if we're not turned outward. We can't see and hear one another. We can't know one another. Second, if we're not turned outward, how can we know the context of our community to figure out what strategies even make the most sense to move forward? Everywhere I go, people keep telling me, one size doesn't fit all in terms of strategies in our communities, or that these strategies keep getting imposed on my community. I'm tired of it. Or these strategies come in from out of town, or someone dreams them up in town, and they literally don't fit the context of our community. And what I say to folks is, well, the only way to really understand the context of your community is to be turned outward toward it. And then we can figure that out. Third, I think if we want to develop a stronger society moving forward, a more hopeful society, then we've got to figure out what helps us build what I would call the enabling environment of our communities, the underlying conditions, the leaders we need, the networks we need, the organizations that bring people together across dividing lines that we need, like all the public libraries we're working with, the United Ways or other groups across the country. We need to figure out what enabling environment our community needs in order to take action on certain issues, whether in Hawaii, where we're working to ensure that all kids have equitable access to education, or to ensure in some communities where we're working that we can actually tackle and maybe take a real shot at solving the opioid crisis in so many of our communities that is wreaking havoc on people's lives and families. So if we're not turned outward, we won't know what the shape of our enabling environment's in and what kind of enabling environment we need to build in order to move forward. Fourth, I think we need to be turned outward because while I'm really interested in impact, I want to know every day what kind of work, for instance, the Institute's efforts are helping people in communities create impact in people's lives. Here's what I've also come to know much more deeply, particularly in the last, 10 years or so. And it's this: as much as we need to be concerned about impact, I think we actually also need to be as concerned about belief. I think one of the things that's challenging us in our country right now, particularly this week, in the face of this violence and growing incivility and this destructive divisiveness that we're experiencing all the time, is how do we restore our belief that we can actually come together and get things done together? I think that's what people want to know. How can we restore our belief? I think there are ways to do that, and that'll be a topic of another Harwood half hour in the future. But just in terms of why it's so important to turn outward, how would we know how to bring people together to restore belief if we're turned inward toward ourselves or our own organizations? It seems to me that we need to be turned outward toward our communities and make sure that our communities are the reference point for everything that we do, as opposed to our organizations being the reference point for everything that we do. And then lastly, I think we need to turn outward so that we can focus on the narratives of our communities, the stories we tell each other, about ourselves, and figure out how we're going to move forward together. So I meant to ask you a while ago what questions you might have as I'm talking about all this. And so I hope in the time that we have left, as I get used to doing this, I won't forget to ask you to do that. I did remember to ask you to tell me whether or not you can hear me and where you're from. But in the time we have left, in the few minutes we have left, I hope you'll tell me whether or not you have questions about turning outward, about what is difficult for you in turning outward, whether it's personally, or in your work, and whether or not how we can address some of that. So if you have a question, send it our way. I know for some people, the question is, how do I turn outward if no one else is going to follow me? And what I would say is this: none of us are expected to solve all these problems on our own. They're just too big. And I think one of the reasons why so many of us feel helpless, some of us feel hopeless right now, is that the challenges can just seem so big, and we can feel as though that if we can't solve the whole challenge, then why work on something? Why take action? And what I know is that while none of us can solve the problems that we face on our own, that each of us has some responsibility and obligation to make a contribution, and probably even more importantly than the sense of contribution or the sense of obligation or responsibility, is that each of us has an opportunity. That if we step forward and start to do things differently, if we begin to demonstrate what it means to turn outward, if we begin to demonstrate what it means to make the community the reference point for what we're doing, then I think other people can see it. Other people can begin to know what it means, what it looks like, what it sounds like. And what I know is then that other people will begin to engage in that way as well. I think more than anything right now, people want a sense of hope, that tomorrow can be better than today, that we can actually tackle some of these challenges. And that hope will come not because we're solving all our problems comprehensively, or that somehow or another we've snapped our fingers, the opioid crisis has disappeared, or that all kids now are getting the education that we hope. None of us believe that that's possible. As much as we'd like it to happen, it's not possible. I think where people gain hope is a sense that we're seeing small steps being taken, that we're putting hard issues on the table and starting to surface them and illuminate them and recognize them, that we're demonstrating that even if we can't solve some of these things or even come to agreements, that we can at least begin to talk about them, and that we can, in a sense, witness for one another that these things are happening. And so I think in order for all of that to occur, I think we've got to turn outward. I think we've got to turn outward, and we've got to see and hear one another. I think for us to do this, we're going to have to open ourselves up to one another. We're going to have to make ourselves more vulnerable in a time when being vulnerable is not easy and can be difficult. And I think we're going to have to make ourselves visible, which means that I think we're going to have to step forward. We're going to, in a sense, have to say, here I am, I'm ready to go to work. I'm ready to find other people of goodwill who want to work with me, and that I'm going to try to make a go of creating change in our communities. Someone wants to know who's the right person to encourage to turn outward. It's a great question. First, what I would say is the right person to encourage to turn outward, first and foremost, this is easy. I'd ask you, when you look in the mirror tonight, or when you look in the mirror tomorrow morning when you're getting ready for work or for taking your child someplace or whatever it may be that you're doing in the morning, ask yourself, am I turned outward? Is my orientation, my posture, my stance, turning outward is not a technique, it's an orientation, it's a frame of mind, a mindset. And so the right person to encourage to turn outward, first and foremost, is ourselves. We have the most control over ourselves. We have the most power over ourselves. We know ourselves, hopefully, the best of anyone else on this earth. And so first, I would say, ask yourself to turn outward. Next, I would look for someone who you know has some disposition to turn outward. Don't take on the hardest person. Don't take on the person who's least likely to turn outward. Don't take on the person who's constantly at your throat or complaining all the time. Find someone you know who believes that we can do better. Find someone you know who you believe believes we can build a more hopeful society if we come together. Find someone you know who believes that it's important to see and hear other people. And I would go to those people in your workplace, in your place of worship, in your child care centers, wherever you may find yourself, and begin to work with those individuals. It's kind of a coalition of the willing. And I would start there. Couple last things, and then we'll close for today. People often ask me, you know, Rich, we just came off a week of violence. There's tons of incivility and hate mongering in our country and demagoguery. What makes you believe that if enough of us turn outward, somehow or another, something can change in the country? And I always say, you know, look, I think I really believe this, the greatest lesson of American history is that we have all sorts of stains on our civic fabric. We have done so many wrong things in our country and made so many wrong moves, and we continue to. And yet, over and over again, whether it's with the founding of the country during colonial times, or whether it was fighting against slavery, or whether it was fighting for child welfare laws, or whether it was fighting for women's suffrage, or whether it was fighting for seatbelt laws, or fighting for a local neighborhood to come back, we have demonstrated time and again that change often starts by groups of people, like-minded folks coming together. Civil rights movement is another example of like-minded folks coming together and beginning to create change in their local communities, that change beginning to spread and being amplified, and people telling stories about it, and people all across the country in an uncoordinated way beginning to move forward in a similar way. And I actually believe as I travel the country that that's happening today, that notwithstanding all the violence and hatred and stuff that we're seeing, that there are these pockets moving forward and people are innovating, creating change, and we'll talk about that in other Harwood half-hour sessions. But so I believe based on our history, not a theory, not something I read in a book, you know, some conceptual thing that somebody dreamed up, but based on experience and history, that we can do this. I know that some of us feel just full of despair. We feel helpless and hopeless. We feel discord, the discords that are happening. I know it, I hear it. I sometimes feel it myself. But what I want you to take away from today is this. If we turn outward, we can create hope. We can create hope because we can find other people who want to turn outward with us, and we can start to create change in our own lives and in our greater community lives. And what we do and what we say matters. And we have the capability not to change the world, but to make a contribution. So I hope today has been helpful. I look forward to seeing you in future Harwood half hours. You know, next Tuesday's the midterm elections, a lot of elections happening in governor seats in many states across the country. Every state legislature in the country and every state is up for election. And so next Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern time, I'll be talking about the midterm elections, and I won't be procrastinating about the next presidential race or anything like that. But I will be talking about how do we move forward from here? What do we make of what just happened? And how do we, those of us who believe we can do better and be better, how do we build a more hopeful society? How do we do it one step at a time in practical ways? So thanks for joining me. This is, as you know, our 30th anniversary that we're celebrating. I'm really excited about it. These Harwood half hours are part of it. Our work is now spread to all 50 US states and 40 countries. Our work is rooted, as you know, in the philosophy of civic faith and is driven by the practice of turning outward. And while we're celebrating our history, most of all, we're looking forward to working with you to take on the challenges that we face today and in the future in our country and in other societies, to make sure that every person can fulfill their God-given potential and has a shot at fulfilling the American dream or whatever the dream may be in their country. And so thanks for joining me. I look forward to seeing you next week. Be well.